it's about self-labeling as though I am this thing. I have done something shameful and that thing somehow defines me. Rather than an act, because an act can be corrected. You know, we can atone for our guilt. I suppose that's a classic.
I did something I wish I hadn't. I feel bad about it, but I can sort that out later.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel shame, that's deep, deep.
Clinical psychologist Ben Larke takes a deep dive into shame, how it begins, how it affects us, and how to overcome it.
And of course, when we engage in anything which is a secret from our partner, then we start to build walls between us and others. And then we start to become like an actor in a part, and we feel inauthentic. So we're not only disconnected from those people around us, we're also disconnected from ourselves, because in most of the hours of the day when we're around other people, we just feel like an automaton kind of performing a role rather than our true selves, right? And true selves means an integrated self, means accepting the good, the bad, and the ugly.
The statistics of men in midlife in relation to mental and physical health are often confronting. Now, there are many complex reasons for this, and there are many examples of great work being done to address the underlying causes. One very recent positive initiative is the UK government launching its first ever dedicated men's health strategy in England. It was launched in the English Parliament on International Men's Day, the 19th of November, where they announced a comprehensive 10-year plan aiming to tackle deep-rooted health inequalities, to improve health outcomes and to encourage men in seeking help earlier. Now, that's just great stuff. Today, I wanted to examine an often misunderstood and avoided topic and how that relates to overall mental health, substance and sex addictions, relationship breakdowns at midlife, and often much more. The topic is shame. Brené Brown brought the understanding of shame to mainstream attention in her TED Talk in 2010, which went completely viral. And I wanted to understand how shame impacts men specifically, what we can do to address any semblance of shame within ourselves. And so I invited Ben Larke onto the show. Ben is a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and in working with men who are navigating midlife transitions. He's also on a mission to demystify what therapy is and what it can do to help men navigate midlife successfully. And in our conversation, Ben shares both professional insights and some personal experiences of shame and its impacts. We also discuss midlife reinvention, and Ben offers a deeply human perspective on the benefit of therapeutic work and how it can help personal transformation. At the end of the episode, I'm going to share with you some reflections that I've had about the conversation with Ben, and I'm going to suggest one experiment to play with if you found the conversation resonating with you. If you want a downloadable handout, go to don'tlettheoldmanin.com/reflections.
From our studio in Jones Bay Wharf, Sydney, here's Pod O'Sullivan with Don't Let the Old Man In, a podcast from the Wisdom Vault.
Let's start here. In 2012, the Sydney radio presenter Alan Jones was hosting a private function, and he was cited later as saying, in reference to the recently deceased father of our then Prime Minister Julie Gillard, he said, "The old man recently died a few weeks ago of shame," referencing the Prime Minister. Now, he was universally condemned. He lost all his advertisers. He now has got his own trouble. But what struck me at the time was he didn't say the old man died of confusion or delusion or embarrassment, or it was shame. And I remember thinking, that is a strong word. That's a really, and it evokes so much. And so one of the reasons I wanted to invite you here today, Ben, is there's been a lot of talk about shame in the last couple of years in the general media, often about women, rarely about men. I thought, oh, this is an interesting topic. So let's start here. What is shame?
It's a good question. That's an interesting quote, or I suppose statement that was attributed to him. And it kind of gets at the heart of why it's problematic and probably why it evokes such a strong response. And of course, we think that's abhorrent to us, I suppose. It's abhorrent to us all, the idea of being ashamed of your child. And why is that such a problematic thing? As you say, he's not using other words he could have used. He could have said he died of guilt. But he doesn't. And so the implication there, I think, gets at the heart of what we understand about the nature of shame and why it's such a big word for so many of us. And it's that thing about, I suppose it's the classic distinction between shame and guilt. It's the thing about it's a state of being rather than a simple action. We can be guilty about our actions, but we're ashamed of who we are.
Is that the distinction?
That's one of the distinctions that's often made. And I find it quite a useful one.
I've never heard that distinction before. That's really, really helpful. Because as soon as you said it, like there's an emotional kind of, oh, wow, that's a strong distinction.
And I think it's at the heart of why so many of us struggle with shame, because it's about self-labeling as though I am this thing. I have done something shameful and that thing somehow defines me, rather than an act, because an act can be corrected. You know, we can atone for our guilt. I suppose that's a classic.
I did something, I wish I hadn't. I feel bad about it, but I can sort that out later.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel shame, that's deep, deep, and it goes to who I am as a person, or who I'm not as a person.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Tied very much to the nature of how we see ourselves.
What's happening in the brain? I mean, like in terms of like what are we thinking cognitively, or what's happening that allows that identity understanding to develop or not to develop?
Identity's at the core of it, I think. These essential statements that we make about ourselves, right? Very uncomfortable statements often. And this sounds possibly a bit weird, but I've come to think of it as the statements. You know, remember Monty Python and Terry Gilliam's animations?
Yes, indeed.
You remember the finger coming down through the clouds of God? Yeah. With the pointing at the person. I often think of it that way, that the voice of shame speaks like that to us. And it says these things like, you are unlovable, right? You are not good enough. You are defective. You know, it's these huge, big, all-encompassing statements that seem to come from above, but actually they come from inside of our own heads sometimes. And that's probably the most disquieting aspect of them, is that we believe so much of what's inside of our heads we believe to be true. You know, we listen to the inner voice and we just take it as factual.
Is that because it triggers our nervous system, and it's like the fight-flight syndrome response, and our body can't distinguish between is this real versus this not real, but my body feels the same no matter what?
I think so. Like we're talking about, when we talk about that sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system that kind of is the operating system for fight-flight, we're talking also, I think, that it's often associated with anxiety, but I think really where it comes from is threat. It's a threat response system. We are absolutely hardwired for it. It is at the core of all of us. As I say, it fuels anxiety, and necessarily fuels anxiety because evolutionarily we needed to be anxious. We needed to worry about future consequences because it led to us sometimes being able to make better decisions in the present that had life-saving consequences for us. So if I go left, I go right at a pathway, but I don't go right because last week, I encountered the saber-toothed tiger down that path and I remember that and I predict that it might be there. I'm worried that it might be there. Then I choose left and I get to live another day. That's all well and good when we're talking about, response to predators and response to physical corporeal threat, but it's less helpful in today's society, because often what we're talking, we live relatively, many of us, not all of us, unfortunately, but many of us live relatively contained, safe lives where we're not subject to physical threat regularly. And so what we are exposed to, though, is threat through society, right? So social anxiety, and I don't mean classical diagnostic social anxiety, but just the anxiety we feel about living, often comes down to what threatens my sense of identity, what threatens my sense of who I am, my self-esteem. So if there's a voice inside of me saying you're worthless, that's a threat to me, right?
I often wonder, as we have evolved as a species, and to your point about saber-toothed tigers and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottom level of our hierarchy needs is protect against the saber-toothed tiger, like get food, survive. Most of us in society have progressed beyond those fears, but that safety mechanism has never progressed. So it's now just looking for another threat somewhere. So it's not this in terms of where's my food coming from or where's the target coming from. I'm looking for a threat from somewhere else.
Yeah. And I think for many of us, particularly people who've experienced trauma in their early life, there's a sensitivity, there's a predisposition to hypervigilance, because you've been exposed to often very threatening situations and scenarios. And of course, that that activates the limbic system. It kind of gets all of these parts of our brain firing that are designed to cope with that, and it sensitizes us. So we develop, we're all born with the same apparatus, neurologically speaking, but then that apparatus is shaped by our life experience. And if our nervous system has something deeply affecting in it, and deep learning is done when we're under significant stress or significant distress, our brains are learning intensely at those times, and they're making hard-coded rules for how we will respond. There are many, many choices we can make at those crossroads when we feel ourselves to be threatened. We can go into fight flight. We can go into that hyperactivated, heart beating fast. We're pumping super oxygenated blood out to the muscle groups. We're tensing, we're flushing, we're hot, all of those things. But we might also freeze, because that's a absolutely permissible survival strategy, and sometimes it's the most helpful one we can make in a threatening situation, is just to shut down. I mean, I say choice. It's not that it is a conscious choice. I think for many people, it's entirely subconscious.
And in that moment, we learn something, don't we?
In that moment, we learn, especially when we're young, this works for me, this saved my life. And that coding goes in. And unfortunately, what we'll then do is misjudge situations later in life, and we'll have a default mode of operations. So a trigger will come in and we'll go into our default response. But that response in the follow-up circumstance when we're older may not be the most appropriate one. So we might find ourselves shutting down in a situation where we really need our voice.
In your practice, you do a lot of work with men in midlife. I'm imagining this is a common conversation in some way or other. Going back to when we were 8, 10, 15, whatever that age is, what are some of the common experiences that we have that some of us then code that to be a shameful experience, or whatever sense we make of it, and how does that then show up in 40s, 50s, 60s?
For many folks I work with, many men I work with, when we go back to what has been laid down and what were those formative experiences that have come up and resurfaced in later life, often I feel like they catch up with us in later life. I'm often working with guys who have been on the go all the way through their lives, always moving, always on to either the next country or the next project or the next thing, the next job, the next relationship, the next marriage, moving. That kind of frenetic energy. And here we're kind of picking up on that fight-flight theme, right? People who are in flight all the time. And then what happens around middle age is life tends to slow us down. We tend to get more settled. We tend to have the accoutrements of middle age. We tend to have the house, the stable career. Not all of us, obviously, but for some. And then that stopping when you've arguably got it all, you've got the things you've been striving for, suddenly bang. Suddenly this stuff catches up, and people will find themselves activating in ways that they just can't explain. As to what forms those kind of experiences, what can set those predispositions, 8, 10, I would say even younger sometimes. 0 to 6 are kind of key years in infancy when we're doing so much brain development, such rapid forming of that kind of Play-Doh brain that we've got. And we're doing deep, deep learning, even in pre-verbal times. If we think about attachment wounds, we're often going back to those very early years. And we might be thinking about what's the circumstance of the parents, what kind of availability, what kind of access do they have as parents for their children? Are they able to provide the basic needs of any child, right? Stability, predictability, unconditional love. Can they do that? Because we can't all do that. And it's often, that's not to put blame or shame, particularly not shame on the parents, but it's just to say people work with the conditions, with the resources that they have, with the awareness that they have as well. When we think about intergenerational change, I'm often working with guys of our age and above, and I know that when I'm talking about their parents, I'm also kind of talking about my parents and that generation.
Yeah.
And so what was their awareness?
Yeah, but when I think about that generation as my parents, your parents, first of all, there was no mainstream media to begin with, right? Each country would have had the national news, like in your case, the BBC, in my case, RTA, one channel.
Yeah.
So there was no mainstream.
No.
And then in the case of Ireland, where I grew up, the church was a very loud voice. So this kind of conversation would never occur in that consciousness. So therefore, when I think of my parents and their generation, they would have had very low consciousness of some of these topics. and even lower awareness of what they do as parents and how that might impact, because they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to do their best, right?
Right.
So what you're saying is that intergenerational awareness is we are becoming more and more aware as we get older of stuff that they were never aware of, and therefore their impact they might have had.
I would say, terms like parenting, childhood, they've been in play for a long old time, right? Linguistically. However, our understanding and the importance that we attach to terms like parenting and childhood has radically changed just in the gap between our parents and ourselves. I think the respect and the attention that we now pay to what it is to be a parent. What are the qualities of a good parent? We're not talking about that stuff a lot, right? Daytime TV, you watch any show, there'll be some reference to good parenting, and people implicitly know what they're getting at these days. Whereas I think for our parents, if you talked about good parenting, they'd be scratching their heads. They'd probably be able to describe for you, what a good child constituted, and more or less that was kind of, I suppose it's not maybe our parents, but the generation before, seen and not heard.
Yeah. An obedient child is a good child.
An obedient child is a good child.
Yeah, and the child who does what the parents want, including taking over their business, that's a good child.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of the things that I hear, and I'm not as exposed to this as you are, which is why I really want you to come on. When I was a child, I was always compared to my elder sister or brother. And therefore, even when I went to school, I wasn't called my name. I was called their younger brother. Yeah. That's how I got known as. And when I'm thinking about where I am at work today, I don't like sharing my opinion. That's the association I sometimes hear. Or I was different to my siblings, and my family just didn't understand me at all. And they insisted I do X, which was never me. And now, 20 years later, I am working really, really hard to find love anywhere I can get it, because I'm searching for it. So I hear that sometimes. Yeah. What kind of stuff do you hear or come across?
That resonates strongly with my own story and with many of the people that I work with, I think, in terms of did we feel validated in our childhood for who we were, just as we were, without necessarily needing to demonstrate a particular set of skills or to be as good as, as high achieving as, in your case, as you're pointing to, older siblings. Did we have an identity that was distinct and allowed for us? Or were we called by, the name of our older siblings, which kind of is a little small act of erasure, right? We can experience it that way. Those are certainly some of the things that come up in terms of family dynamics and how they play out. I think validation is such an important source of identity for us. If we are loved for who we are, just as we are, and we are told implicitly, right, it doesn't have to be languaged, but through the acts of love that come to us from our parents, we feel like we are enough, just as we are. If we can get access to that, it's a wonderful thing, because there's the basis for developing a secure basis of attachment within the individual, because they feel like I am enough just as I am. That means that I can love someone else and at the same time feel lovable in return, because I'm worthy of love, as well as what I want to give love. I can receive it. And so, we know that many people with attachment wounds, the manifestations in relationship with another, that's often where it'll really show up, where the attachment wounds will really show up, because there can be...
Can you tell us what that is, attachment wound? Many people may not know that phrase.
There's this notion that there are modes of attachment that are formed when we're young, that the infant-caregiver bond is a crucial one. I'm thinking of this old black and white footage that was taken by a French researcher, Beatrice Bebe, maybe. Anyway, I forget the name. A lot of what they were interested in, this is, back in the 60s, 70s, they were interested in studying what went on in the dyadic relationship between caregiver and child. And they took lots of videos of particularly mothers with their babies holding them. And then they looked at what was happening in those micro moments. How much of the gaze was going back and forth? How much mimicry was there? In terms of the baby throws out a signal. The baby will, ooh. And then how does the mother respond to that? Is she attentive? Is she noticing? Because normally as a parent, if we're holding our child and they make a noise, we'll make a noise in response. So we'll mimic them. That goes in. That all kind of serves, I think, to say, I notice you. You're important to me. in a way, I want to play with you. This is the first play we ever do, you know.
Yeah.
Before we've learned to control our digits, you know, we'll be playing with our gaze, playing with our voices. And I think that all goes towards this, if we can form it, healthy attachment. But what happens when we don't get the opportunity to do that or to experience that? So, and it's all too easy to imagine. Again, not wishing to shame anyone, not wishing to blame, but just thinking about parents that are under pressure, parents that are distracted, parents that are experiencing high levels of anxiety because of like environmental stresses around them, and putting food on the table is a real problem, and all of those kind of circumstances, which means that I'll be with my child, but I'll be thinking,
I think of something else.
Yeah.
I'm trying to cook dinner, and I'm trying to
cook dinner, trying to manage the other siblings, and then I've got, you know, maybe the bailiff's coming around later to start repossessing things. I don't know what's going on. Like, there lots of things go on for parents. But does that interrupt? Because all of that can, and it can mean that we're looking away in that moment, or we're not really gazing, or we put them down and leave a sibling to play with them because we've got other stuff to take care of in that moment. All of that matters. Because what happens when a child is throwing out those signals, and they can be playful signals, but they can also be signals of distress, right? It can be a cry, a wail, I need to be changed.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
But what
you can
happens,
tell I've got a 6-week-old granddaughter, can't you?
See, these are like the formative memories for me, because as soon as I start talking about this stuff, I'm talking about, like, I'm thinking very much about holding my children as babies and those interactions. And for a while there, I noticed that I think I picked up on a fact, because we had our boys as children. We were living in East Timor at the time, and we had a great lady called Rita who was helping us out with the kids, and she did this rocking dance with the babies. She had like this 2-step dance, which is kind of Timorese. Every wedding, birthday you go to, everyone does this great 2-step sort of shuffle, and she'd do it with the kids, so they'd really learnt to get into this rhythm. And I'd picked it up off Rita because it was a great way to settle the boys. They really got to love that rocking movement thing. And then there was one day at the shops where I was standing. So our kids, my son was like 3 months at the time, and I was back in Australia waiting to get served in Coles. I didn't even have my child on me, but the lady in front of me had a child who started crying, and I started dancing involuntarily. It's just like, and I'm like, what am I doing?
And everyone around is going, he wants that child.
Yeah.
So the moving from, you know, like, there's not a lot a baby can do other than throw out signals. And there's not a lot a baby will recognize at the moment of throwing out the signals that they are being received or not received, right? So what you're pointing to is this is the foundation of where this stuff starts. From a masculinity point of view, and I'm raising this because in the English Parliament 2 days ago, it's quite extraordinary. They recognised for the first time ever in UK history the importance of treating men's health differently, in terms of how do we address men and men's health and men's mental health in a way that actually goes to the root cause, in a way we can help, and it hasn't been done before. And a lot of the work's been done by a guy called Paul Geddes from New York and various masculinity researchers. Now, I give all that as context because the whole notion of boys don't cry, don't be a crybaby, be stoic, like, masculinity is often taught to do that. And I'm just thinking about what you said in terms of those of us as kids who didn't get what we need, taught to be stoic, wasn't able to express anything. Suddenly you're hitting 50, and as you said, you're in a place of stability. It catches up, right? And I was talking to someone yesterday who described it beautifully. He said, God, in his views was, God has a series of little hammers. It starts with a small one, gives you a message, you don't hear it, gradually comes up to bigger and bigger hammers, and eventually when you hit 50, bang, you get the message, right?
Exactly. But it also feels like, are you listening? Are you listening?
Yeah.
Right, come on.
That's right.
Pay attention.
What's your experience of this whole area from a male point of view, i.e., are we conditioned to ignore this until we can't ignore it any longer? Are we conditioned to not talk about this until we have no more choice?
It can be the case. I think it certainly can be the case for a lot of guys that they will feel. I've certainly worked with people who have come in with the feeling of being backed into a corner, and often they'll be sent in. Often I've worked with guys who are like, I'm here because my wife has told me. It's like, come and talk to you.
Or else. Right.
We're over.
It's an ultimatum.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Not exactly the most conducive circumstances to start therapy in, but it's a starting point nonetheless.
Well, not for the first session at least.
Yeah.
And so there is something that that catalyzes, I need to talk about this to somebody else?
Often I think that, there can be all kinds of catalytic events. They can be, behaviors that people have engaged in that have come to the surface, whether we're talking about lies that have been told, deceits that have been embarked upon, addictions that have been carried on behind closed doors, which have started to surface and started to have wider repercussions in the family system. All of those things can be trigger points. And sometimes in these more enlightened times, I would say, though, that's not to say that everyone comes in because they feel they have to and there's nothing left. I'm also working with some guys who are coming in because they see this as the next step in their development. And they realize, I think they probably always known that there was the stuff in the cupboard that they were going to have to deal with one day. And for some guys, there can be that point of, I'm now at a point of stability. I've now got things together enough in my life that I can I think for any of us who unlock the cupboard door and let everything tumble out, there's concern there, right? Because this could create instability in my life if I do this. And often it can be activating, right? When we start to explore legacies of the past, we'll often find ourselves, our nervous system will start to react, and we may go back to coping behaviors that we used when we were young, right? If we were fleeing into substance use when we were young, and then we start to revisit traumatic events. I've known people who will start to use again through their therapeutic journey. It's unfortunate, and of course we attend to that as a matter of first principles, right? Because we need people to be safe, we need people to be stable. But yeah, sometimes these things can manifest. Sometimes they'll come out in all kinds of different ways. I used to work with someone who'd talk about the whack-a-mole of working with compulsive behaviors that emerge as a response to trauma work, right? So you start off working on the substance use that someone's engaged in, you get that covered, and then like 2 months later they say, yeah, I'm actually broke because I'm buying a lot of stuff online.
I just changed my addiction.
Shopping. Exactly. It moves around.
What is the connection between trauma, whatever trauma means, shame and addictions? Because it feels to me that they're very, very closely connected. Indeed, one might catalyze the other. I'm not sure which way it is.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that I have a definitive answer on that topic. I find it a fascinating topic. When we engage in a compulsive behavior, the very nature of a compulsive behavior is such that we're going to feel guilt about it, right? Because a compulsive behavior means that I'm doing something that in my rational, cognitive, logical mind, I don't want to do.
So in order to escape some pain, I'm creating more pain elsewhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I'd read into that. Of course, why would we engage in more pain creation? There kind of has to be function. I always think with anything that manifests in our life, we don't do anything by accident, right? There has to be a function. Even with forms of addiction, which are incredibly damaging, incredibly detrimental to the individual, whether it's financial or kinds of the tear down of the relationships that they precipitate, right? Still has to be a function for the substance use. And that's what I find really interesting to talk to guys about, is like, what are you getting from this? I mean, aside from the high, right? The high is a thing, right? Flight is a thing, like getting out of a situation while your physical corporeal body kind of sits in that. If you're struggling with that, then just to take leave of the situation mentally by getting high or getting drunk or whatever it is, it can work.
It's
that
useful
can be a function. In a way, it's a form of escape.
Yeah.
In the short term, of course. Also, people will talk to me about, numbness is a thing. That classic thing, like when I take a substance, the volume that in my mind just turns goes right down. And all of a sudden, there's also, I think, for some guys, we spend a lot of time talking about reward, right? So actually, for me to do this thing that I do, everyone's gone to bed, I'm on my own at night, no one's aware of what I'm doing, and then I do this thing. This is kind of my reward to myself, because this is me time. This is me indulging myself.
Be it that a substance, be it alcohol, be it pornography, be it whatever it is.
Exactly. There can be all kinds of different reasons underpinning the addictive patterns of behavior. And in terms of the relationship to shame, I don't know, I have a sort of pet theory on this that is not fully formed in my own head, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately. It's been batting around my head. I shouldn't say that. I've been thinking about it clearly. But it's like, what do we do when we do a behavior that we're ashamed of? Well, we often go into a state of shame. We often feel that fundamentally that we're wrong, that we're not worthy. All of these kind of ideas will come up, often associated with indulgence in a substance, in an addiction, in a compulsive behavior, be it drugs, alcohol, sex, whatever it is. So what I think about this is that state of being in shame. For some folks, I think when you trace back to the early life, there's a long history of feeling ashamed. There's a long history of feeling like I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy. It often starts back in childhood. Often humiliation at the hands of, and look, I guess I've got new respect for the validity of childhood bullying. It doesn't get talked about enough, I think, about how deep those impacts can go. But sometimes that deep shame that's felt in that childhood, not to say bullying is the only thing, all kinds of things, sexual abuse, bereavement, all these things can contribute to trauma. But if I felt fundamentally ashamed back then, my nervous system habituated to feeling as though it was normal for me to be in a state of shame. And again, I've worked with someone years ago who said to me once, I thought she was absolutely spot on with this. She said, we will often repeat patterns, we will often repeat cycles, we will often repeat behaviors or make the same kind of choices that are not necessarily helpful or healthy for us. And it's not because we want to, right? It's not because we're like magnetically drawn to bringing these people into our lives if it pertains to people, right? She just says like, it's a fit thing. So my nervous system knows how to operate in a system of shame, it's a
familiar place.
It's a familiar
place. And I've
place.
got comfort there in the past. Although the comfort became uncomfortable, it's familiar.
Discomfort can feel in its own kind of strange way comfortable because I know discomfort. I know what it is to feel off kilter.
Yeah.
I know what it is, and often I know what it is to feel ashamed.
Yeah. And of course, and I'm linking a few different things here, but sometimes the discomfort of that takes away the noise of this.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to avoid.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's a really good point. It gives me something very obvious to focus on because now I'm just thinking about why did I do that thing? Again, why did I do it? It's not like casually, why did I do that thing? Some intellectual exploration. It's like, why did I do that thing again? That's the experience. But that's a lot, right? And that's a lot to focus on. And in a way, that is a distraction away from the bigger questions, the bigger things that are often the drivers of that behavior that are sit underneath that we don't have time to get to because we're so caught up in the here and now, in the distraction of the proximal.
Part of the reason, and you and I have been having conversations like this off camera and often over a glass of one of different types, you have a real strong belief in demystifying the therapeutic process, as in don't make it... How do you make it more accessible? How do you make it not, something that happens behind a glass window or whatever? And I'm interested in, like from our listeners' point of view, who are listening to you talking, going, some of what you say sounds familiar to me.
Yeah.
But the idea of going and talking to a stranger, like who I've never met you before, why would I do that? And I'll only come if someone like my wife says, you got to go or else. Right? Talk us through the process of someone who's not exposed to any of the reading or thinking that you've been exposed to, but is hearing you talk and say, this sounds a bit like me. Why would I want to go and talk to someone like Ben?
Yeah, it's a good question. Why, from a cold start, why would you want to embark upon and embrace what is often a difficult and a painful journey of self-understanding? And I would say, I suppose, a simple, almost trite response is that change has to start with understanding, right? So if we're experiencing suffering, and of course we're all experiencing suffering because that's kind of the nature of life, right? If we're experiencing suffering and we want to do something to change that, then understanding has to be the first step. I have to start understanding why I keep falling in the same hole again and again and again and again. First of all, to get out of that hole, I need to work out where a ladder is to get me back out. I need to take responsibility for being in the hole as well, because there's something that I'm doing that is contributing to this hole. Now, all of that is very difficult work, but I would argue that developing insight into that is something that needs to happen if we want to start making choices to step around the hole, right, in future, and to start walking down a different street beyond that. And that's often for most folks, if they could do it on their own, they would have done it by now, because they've been suffering for decades with these kind of themes. And of course, I'm not talking to everyone here, but for some people, they will know this thing keeps happening. I'm not sure why. If I could change it, I would have done it. And this is not me saying, like, come to me because I'm the guy who can fix it, because I don't know. Like, I don't know what the pain is, and I don't, all kinds of reasons.
But what you're saying is, if something's been happening for a long time, again and again and again, and it's compulsive, which another word for, I think, for compulsive that's useful is you're doing something in secret. And that's a signal.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the first signal of, hold on, if no one knows you're doing this and you don't want them to know, that's a sign that something's going on.
And we're back to shame again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Where we started.
Yeah.
Let's just pause for a second. If you've made it this far, it must mean you're enjoying the show. We want to keep bringing you awesome conversations, but algorithms are like needy toddlers. They demand constant validation. So if you're liking this, please hit the like button, the follow button, the subscribe button, whatever button. It helps us land more great guests to keep entertaining you. And if you're listening to this on an audio podcast app, come over and watch us on YouTube. I promise we're reasonably photogenic. Back to the show.
Yeah.
I spoke to someone yesterday who was telling me a story about their experience of the 12 steps process. And they were forced into it initially by their partner, who I believe said to him, there's nothing in you. I don't know who I'm with. There's no
connection.
Human inside the human in front of me.
Yeah.
And he said to me, I'd heard that phrase a few times before, so I realized, okay, it can't be just her, right? But do I want to go to 12 steps, right? For a range of reasons. And he described it as this: the first few weeks and months I went there, I'm looking at everybody else going, they are losers. What idiots. I said, then I started listening to the stories, and it took me 2 or 3 more months, and I realized, oh, these stories are familiar. And they said, maybe on the 6th month, I realized, oh, I am them. And so it was only then could I start actually realizing that the person who forced me in here is looking for connection with me, and I was just had a barrier wall all around me. He wasn't able to do it.
Yeah.
What struck me in his realization, and he was now 10 years post 12 steps, so he's been living at post 12 steps, is we often are missing empathy and connection with our loved ones, and we don't even know that. And that might be a big enough reason to try and go on a journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, there's a lot of truth in that. That has resonance for me for chapters of my life when I found myself living like that. And I think it has resonance for a lot of people that I find myself working with, not to say all, but a significant number of people, where I think we can find ourselves living lives where we are playing the part of an actor, right? And it looks okay to the outside world because, for the guys, they look like good dads, they look like good husbands, they're ticking all the boxes. If you were to take a photo, everything looks in place and correct, according to what society is deemed to be a successful, man and model of masculinity, whatever. But the internal dynamics there, I think you're absolutely right. What's going on, what's missing is often empathetic connection. It's an opportunity to feel understood, to not be living. And of course, when we engage in anything which is a secret from our partner, then we start to build walls between us and others. And then we start to become like an actor in a part, and we feel inauthentic. So we're not only disconnected from those people around us, we're also disconnected from ourselves because, in most of the hours of the day when we're around other people, we just feel like an automaton kind of performing a role rather than our true selves, right? And true selves means an integrated self, means accepting the good, the bad, and the ugly,
That's the part, isn't it? It's the accepting of. Yeah.
It is. It's a big part of it, I think, the integration, right? A notion of self rather than as a distinct individual, unified man. I'm a composite of all these different parts. And one thing that I found helpful for myself to formulate this and to express to others is I now kind of view myself, and this is going to sound a little bit strange, so bear with me with this one, but I kind of view myself as a car driving down the highway of life, right? And inside that car, and this is not new, by the way, this is, I forget who I stole this off originally, but it's kind of...
Someone had an idea.
It's meant more and more to me over the years. In that car, multiple seats, right? You got the passenger seat, the driver's seat. You've got the back seat with lots of seats in there, and all your parts are sitting in that car. For some of us, it's more like a bus, right? A lot of seats in there, a lot of different parts. There's young parts, there's traumatized parts, right? There's adult parts, there's coping parts, there's parental parts, there's the parenting I received and impressed upon me. There's also the parent that I aspire to be. All these parts are in that car somewhere, right? There's one driver's seat. So only one of those parts gets to drive the car at any one time, right? And we don't necessarily get control over who's in that driver's seat. For a lot of us, we don't feel in control of who's in the driver's seat, right? And something will happen in life. There'll be an input stimulus, some trigger will come in, and some part will respond to that and will be promoted into the driver's seat and will suddenly be driving the car, which is great when it's my competent, coping part. Yeah, we're all cool, we're all safe, we're abiding by the speed limit, everything's groovy, we've got nice music on, awesome, great. But you put my traumatized child part in that driving seat, and the rest of us in the car, we're shitting ourselves.
Yeah.
Because there's a child driving. And he's pretty reckless.
And I've seen him before.
Yeah.
This party looks familiar. Right?
Yeah. So increasingly, I think if we want to do the work on ourselves, we've got to work out who's in the car with us, right? Who are the parts? And I suppose when I extend the metaphor, part of the therapeutic journey, and it's not a therapeutic journey, it's not to imply that this only works with a therapist, right? This can work in 12-step, this can work in journeys of self-discovery and self-developed insight, right? People go on all kinds of journeys to develop this ability. But for me, I think increasingly what I'm focused on is I can't control who's going to be in that driving seat, right? But what I try to do more of now is to get a coping part in the passenger seat, with one hand reaching across to the steering wheel, right? Just stabilizing, just helping to keep us on the road.
Do you give those parts names?
Yeah, for some of them, I've definitely got names. I mean, there is a whole kind of school of therapy, which I'm not well enough versed in, but I would like to be one day, of IFS, Internal Family Systems, where they talk very much about this parts model. But there's also lots of other practitioners who have developed parts models. It was a core part of Gestalt theory as well. So kind of there's been reimaginings of this. But for me, yeah, absolutely. I can, and I'm getting a little bit better about labeling and naming and identifying and realizing who's in the driver's seat. And one thing I've started to realize lately, this came out in a conversation with someone I work with, and we were bouncing this idea, this metaphor back and forth. And at the time I was thinking about it and thinking about my car and who's in that. And I expressed to this person, even if the traumatized child part isn't in the driver's seat, it's in the car. Actually, I think it was the person I was working with who said to me, but the traumatized child's always in the car, right? And I was like, yeah, the traumatized child's always in the car. We can't get them out of the car, right? But I said, maybe our job is, if we've got the coping parts around, even if the traumatized child's in the back, sitting in the seat, kind of looking out the window, what we want is the coping part to be able to reach back with a hand and just to hold its hand, to reach back and care for it, right? To reassure it. And I'm having the reaction now that I had then when we were talking together in session. We both started crying at that point because it meant a lot to both of us. I think it was a moment of joint realization.
Yeah,
I can feel the emotion now as I talk about it, because for me that's a significant thing that I'm trying to do for myself.
See, I think that approach, that kind of conversation, is a very accessible one now, particularly as in the last 10 years there's been quite a few movies. We have all the different emotions. The animated movie, they had all these different emotions. You've got movies where you have various parts of your personality playing out.
Yeah.
It's more visible, it's more obvious.
It really is, yeah.
And I remember the very first time someone shared that with me and helped me through a process, whereas I realized for the first time in my life, there's part of me that's extraordinarily sensitive, as in phenomenally sensitive. Part of that makes me really good in my coaching work.
Yeah.
Part of that makes me terrible in an argument. Dreadful. Or it makes me extraordinarily sensitive to, that they're criticizing me in a particular piece.
Yeah.
Once I understood that, I was like, okay, let's give that part a name. And therefore I can easily go, look, thanks for coming. We don't need you in this argument. You can leave now. And it's just simple. It's a simple action that doesn't sound in any way overly therapeutic. It just means I'm just managing myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I have to recognize first there are multiple
spotting
parts.
who shows up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're spotting it when it shows up.
Yeah.
And that voice you use, thanks for coming, but maybe not now.
Yeah,
right? Because that's not going to help.
So you've got to walk out bruised, I can tell you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're touching on something there which is so important. You know, it's a theme that we've sort of weaved around today, but it is the sensitive parts of us as men and sensitivity within masculinity, as we started talking about, as you introduced us earlier, to that idea of stoicism as a often present part of masculinity, for better, for worse, right? There are all kinds of advantages we get from that, but all kinds of disadvantages that can come from that. And I would argue that for most, if not all of us, that sensitivity is on board from the get-go, right? That's just a part of a human being.
That's who we are as humans. That's
so.
What makes us human, maybe.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're social creatures, we're connecting creatures. So it's a core part of who we are. But often guys that I'm working with, it will be something that has been coached to repress, right? It has not been well received. As you said, like all those maxims of boys don't cry, etc., they are common and prevalent, and still sadly around us. Often that sensitive part, that part that can feel hurt, that part that can feel the pain of others, that part that wants to connect to others, has often been put behind a big wall because it was not safe for it to go out. You know, it tried to express itself, it tried to be vulnerable, and it was not well met often.
Therefore, shut that down.
So therefore, shut that down, because that represents risk, and it makes that person feel unsafe when they've tried to express it. And safety is such a huge thing for us as human beings, right? Yeah.
Let's think of the listener who's listening to you and going, okay, I hear what you're saying, Ben. Whatever you're saying is kind of, I'm reacting to it internally. I can feel, there's something about what he's saying. The word secret and compulsive behavior, it's hitting me going, okay, I do something there. I heard what you say about there's a usefulness here, as in, I go to a familiar place and I'm recognizing, my place is, the drink at 2 a.m, or the smoky, or whatever it is. I got a familiar place. But I'm now listening to you, Ben, and going, I don't know I want to continue that. What are my first steps? What do I start doing after I hang up from this podcast?
I would say that for most folks, it's the first important step around, alleviating some of the pain that we feel when we're containing secrets within us, when we're living double lives, or we're putting, false fronts to manage our existence. The first step is often to tell another human being about that, right? And that can be a therapist, that can be whoever, that can be a friend. It doesn't really matter. But importantly, it's, I suppose, a prerequisite for that for many of us is that we need to find someone we can trust.
Yeah.
That's going to take time with a therapist, right? With a relative stranger, right?
Yeah.
It depends. I mean, I've had people walk in and tell me big stuff right away because it's burning a hole inside of them, and they
need to get it out.
Get it out. Yeah. But for some folks who've been containing it and could go on containing it, I would say find someone that you can trust and talk to them about it. Find someone who you respect. Find someone who you know will be able to sit in a relative non-judgmental position of you. Because that thing about, what's the old axiom, like a problem shared is a problem halved, something like that. There's a lot of truth in that more often than not, when we hold our secrets inside, when we hold the things, the shame inside, it's kind of like the monster in the closet, right? We can't see it. We believe it to be there, and we believe it to be enormous. Yeah. It is terrifying when it's in the closet. But we open the door, we let some light in there, we see like it's just a little mouse scurrying around. And I find, having done this myself in my own life and shared some things that I was not proud of and that I was ashamed of with friends, with therapists, I find that once we get it out, that thing that was massive inside of my head that took up all of my field of vision, when I offer it to a friend, it's like, it's that big. Right. Like, it's big, it's serious, it matters. Yeah. But it's not as big as it was when I was containing it in my world. It's not as definitive as I thought it was when it was in my head. And most importantly, that act, that behavior, that thing that I do, that is something that I do, but it is not necessarily me, right? It's not definitive of me.
It doesn't have to have you.
Yeah.
You can do it with you, but it doesn't have to hold you and surround you. Yeah. That metaphor of the Monsters Inc. in the cupboard coming out, it's actually a little scurry mass, but it's still there. That's a very powerful visual of, okay, there's something relieving about sharing that. I mentioned the 12 steps. The AA have a lovely maxim, which I bought into a long time ago, of one of the core principles of the 12 steps is brotherhood in its widest sense of, if you're an alcoholic, you need other people to support you. And this is why it works. As in, your problem shared is not just halved, it's divided by 10, because there's 10 of us in the room. And the sponsor can help you through it. So what you're saying is, your first step is talk to somebody, be it a friend, be it a therapist, be it a priest, be it whatever it is.
Yeah. Start
the talk. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's a lot in that, in the reference to brotherhood there. In terms of, like, you know, what we're driving at here is, I suppose, oriented around relief, the relief that we can sometimes experience of sharing that. But I would also say implicit in 12-step and implicit in the mentorship program there is also another very useful axiom of this, or component part of this, which is also accountability. And that can help if we want to change. Then it's not to say that, you know, your mentor is going to, like, put a rod on your back and kind of force you, but just the very act of having spoken about it and coming up with a plan for how you want to change it. If you're on board with that, then just knowing that someone's going to ask you about how you're going with that, it helps us to be accountable to ourselves, rather than what a lot of us do when we engage in compulsive behavior, which is this kind of like mental fingers in our ears, and we're just doing the thing and we are not thinking about the consequences, because frankly, this is short-term relief. I know that this is not a mid to long-term successful strategy for me.
Yeah, but it's good for now.
It's good for now. It's good enough for now.
Tomorrow I'll think about the other.
Exactly.
Yeah. Actually, I referenced someone I was talking to yesterday about addictive behaviors, and he was talking about that part of the success for him and going through the 12 steps was the sponsor who worked with him, who was only, of course, a few steps ahead.
Yeah.
Because they're never fully, right? They're always, I think it's step 5 that they got to do before they get involved. For his particular addiction, he had to disengage from all aspects of it for 3 months, in terms of not go to venues, not go to whatever, take away all kinds of temptation, knowing, and of course the process knows that, of course, you're going to fall over. You're not going to do it straight away.
Yeah.
But the idea of being held accountable for that was, hey, you're always restarting. You're always restarting till you get on that new way of thinking to overcome whatever it was. And you can't do that by yourself if you've been doing compulsive behavior for 20 years. Like, you need other people to help you.
Yeah, you do. And I think there's a lot in that, right? I mean, first of all, I take from that the 3-month period, right? And then we could get neurological and talk about the dopamine system resetting and finding that new level. That's its own business, right? But also this thing about the necessary lapses that are going to occur, and how, if you're in a relationship with a friend, with a therapist, with a mentor, whoever, right? They're not going to judge you in those moments, right? They're going to recognize this is a lapse, but you're on a good path here, right? This is you learning, right? This is you. This needs to keep happening. The most important thing I think we can develop for ourselves through the process of being connected to others is learn to install that kind of generous, non-judgmental spirit in ourselves. Ideally, further down the track, right? We might still have a lapse like 5 years down the road, but if we can go, that's okay. Right? If we can talk to ourselves as we would talk to a friend, to someone that we were looking after at that moment, and have that generate that internal voice of compassion, and say, oh, that's a shame, right? Yeah, we stuffed up there, but let's try get back on the horse, right? Because this is a better way for us now. That for me is kind of the long-term goal, right? It's if we can start to cultivate inner compassion, we can start to meet those divergent parts of us, those compulsive parts, those parts that are willful, impetuous, or impulsive, right? But if we can start to meet them with a kind of more generous spirit, rather than treat them as exiles, rather than be like othering them from ourselves and pretending that they don't exist. Yeah.
One of the common themes of this podcast is the promise of reinvention in midlife, in the sense of many of us get stuck into an ongoing treadmill and wonder, okay, is this it? And many of us successfully go, no, it's not. I can do many, many different things. I'm guessing, but correct me if I'm wrong here, that a lot of folks who come into a therapeutic type of conversation with someone like yourself feel like they're failing. And at midlife feel like, hey, I might be hitting the crisis aspect of this cliche of midlife crisis. If my hypothesis is true, then what is it about that they're bringing to you, and how do you help them think differently about that?
Yeah, it's a good and an interesting question and an evocative one for me, because I would identify with everything you've just said, right?
For yourself?
For myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with you then.
Well, we can start with me. I'll try and like park some of the thoughts I was having about the general. But yeah, for myself, I am someone who did a bit of midlife reinvention. In my early 40s, I was in a period where things were pretty tricky for me in my life. There was a lot of struggle going on, and an intensity, let's say, to that time. I'd also come out at that point of a career in humanitarian development-oriented work, where I'd sort of, without going too far into that, I'd just come to specialize in a particular area of conflict resolution, that kind of thing, internationally, with a lot of my work done in East Timor. So I was a kind of very niche kind of guy who did a lot of that work and was quite fluid in those circles, but also somewhat burned out from the part of me that was, for various reasons, performing very hard, like really engaging. Not a part that I disavow, but a part that I think was really useful at the time, because I was lucky enough to be involved in some really important work. However, it left me a bit like, the chewed up, spat out chewing gum at the end of it. And so, yeah, I was in my early 40s and come to a point where things in my personal life where there's manifestations of all kinds of things going on there that were not helpful to me and not helpful to the people that were around me. So,
do you mean in terms of the way you were behaving, or you were absent? And I know you don't need to go into details, but like, was it behavior piece? Was it an absence piece? What was it?
Oh, I would say a mixture of the two. Certainly damaging behaviors to people that were around me, and certainly not available. Yeah, because I think often when we are behaving in ways that are damaging, and when we are like embroiled in our own shame, it's very hard for us to be emotionally available to folks around us. So there's a mixture of that going on for me. And I was at the time thinking, I guess because I'd had this very niche career which had gone way bigger than I'd ever expected it to go. However, I didn't find myself satisfied there. I'd also had a point where I'd realized, I think one of my big realizations during this kind of crisis period for me was quite how much of my identity I was taking from what I did. I hadn't realized whilst I was doing that.
This is such a male thing to do.
Yeah.
And we all, not we all do it, but many of us do it.
Yeah, hugely. Hadn't realized how much of my identity was propped up on this status attached to what I did. And I only realized years afterwards in therapy that, to go from where I was at the time working for the United Nations, I was running programs that were dealing in tens of millions of dollars of aid work, channeling those to different agencies. I was advising the Timorese government, helping them to write a national recovery strategy at the time, which was successfully implemented, right? This is not to blow my own trumpet, but it's just to say that in a small pond, I was kind of a big fish in my own head, right?
In that pond you were.
Yeah, in that pond I was. And then I went to, because we relocated for my wife's work and moved out to Jerusalem, and I chose to not work, and I chose to work on being the stay-at-home parent and to help to raise our boys who were 2 and 4 at that time. So I went from like all this money and all these like beneficiaries to like a target group of 2. And, with responsibilities that included like...
And they often didn't do what you said.
And they were way trickier.
Some would argue they still are.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's the real art, right? And full respect to every stay-at-home parent who does the work. It used to get to me because I'd have conversations with other dads at the school gate in those days. And these guys would be, this was Jerusalem, and in that kind of like, and a lot of the guys that were at the school were, doing various high-flying jobs. And they'd be talking to me, so what brings you here? And I'd say, I'm just, right? I'd always prefix it with just. I'm just looking after my kids, right? And they'd go, oh my God, I can't imagine that. That must be so great. Oh, I just wish I could get the time. And I'd be looking at them going, you would not want my life, buddy. Not right now. It's not feeling great to me. Yeah. But there were some great moments in there. But it was certainly, I was forced to examine my life and what I was doing with it, I think, out of necessity. And one of those moments we were talking about earlier, where lots of stuff in my life had started to catch up with me at that point. in various ways. And so I came out of that with a desire to step out of the international aid world and out of that kind of work, and I went back to scratch the itch that had started for me in my early 20s. When I was one of the things I'd done in my early 20s as part of my studies, I'd done a postgraduate diploma. I'd started a postgraduate diploma, I should say, in occupational therapy, because I was scratching around looking for something to do with a very generalized social sciences degree. And as part of that training, I sort of struggled with that training, but as part of that training, I had the opportunity to do, I think it was like a 10-week placement with a community mental health team in England, in the UK. And I worked with an occupational therapist who had done extensive training as a counsellor outside of her role as an occupational, and she was really working as a counsellor in the community. And a wonderful lady who gave me the opportunity to sit in on her sessions, and towards the end of our time together started inviting me to contribute to those sessions. And I loved it. Right, I was like, this is. I remember being young and going, this is where it's at. This is what I wanted to do. And I came back and I spoke to the head of my course and I said, who had told that I was having problems with the course, of course, already. I mentioned this to her, and I came back to her and I said, I think her name was Viv. I was like, it's all okay, Viv. I'm gonna focus on the mental health side of things because this is really. And she was like, look, that's great to know, but unfortunately, we don't offer any counselling training.
It's not here.
It's not here. So I jacked it that week and walked away from that diploma and went away, and then my life took this other turn, and then I end up overseas and I end up doing all this kind of like I'd retrained as an anthropologist. I'd got into this conflict resolution work, I'd done all of these things. This was a thing that I'd never gone back to, and so I had this sort of dawning realization as I was casting about to reinvent myself. I was like, well, maybe I was onto something there. Maybe I was onto something earlier on, and was lucky enough to be able to renew my qualifications in Australia. So I originally held like I majored in psychology and my social sciences. So I had that stuff, but it was all so far out of date that I had to redo in Australian universities the same undergrad, the same honours, and then the Masters in Clinical Psychology on top of that. And that gave me this opportunity to work. And it was a risk. It was a risk for me, I guess. It was a huge risk for my wife, who had to support me through all of this, and an impact on our income and on what was available to our family. But I was lucky enough to have a supportive partner who was helping me to get through that. And luckily for us, because with psychology, they kind of keep you held back. There's a lot of theory in the undergrad, really fascinating stuff, right? Same with the honours, interesting thesis, research project. I went back to Timor and did my research over there. But it's really not until the Masters, until you kind of get let loose on the general public, right? Which is a good thing.
It's a good thing for the general public.
let's be clear about that. But that is kind of the test, right? Because that's the first time really that you're sitting down in a room with another human being, like going, can I do this? Does this feel good to me? Is this, having kind of invested a lot to get to this point, and look, it was one of those things where from the get-go on the Masters in Clin site, where we actually started being taught the therapeutic skills, where I actually started working with people, where I was like, this is kind of like what I was meant to do all along. Yeah.
Can I unpack all of that? Because there's a lot of stuff in what you've just said. Can't even remember what the question was to catalyze that. But there's lots in there that I want to come to. I've had a hypothesis for a long time that if you watch your children closely enough, or if you're attuned to what you gravitate towards. Aaron Bossamer calls this game the warmer colder game. What are you moving towards as warmer, or what are you moving towards as colder in terms of attraction levels, right? And I think if you watch your children closely enough when they're about kind of 6 to 15, you can tell or predict what career they'll end up in if they follow what they are naturally attracted towards. We often bash that out of them, and invariably they come back to it 20, 30 years later, right?
Yeah.
You experienced that in your 20s, and it took you till your late 40s to come back to it. And I remember saying to you maybe a year ago that one of the reasons why I think you're so good at what you do today is because you've been through all the stuff in between, right? You've discovered life, the ups and downs, and you bring a sense of perspective to the work you do that's not purely clinical. It's mature life, and hey, life can be crap at times, and I get what you're talking about, Mr. and Mrs. who's in front of me. So that's my first thing is I think we instinctively as humans often know what we want to do.
Yeah.
We just ignore the signs.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my second point, which is that's why I think midlife reinvention is so possible, is that it allows you to reevaluate what you have been doing and allows you to choose a path of, assuming that financially I can afford to do this, or at least I can figure out a way to do it like you did, I can actually revisit stuff that I haven't done, or I can choose to move towards stuff that I haven't been able to before now, because I've got another 20 or 30 years to do it. I can do it. And that's why I think midlife reinvention is so interesting, because we're doing it purposefully. And you did it very purposefully and came out the other side, in a really good place.
Yeah, I was fortunate with that. To have the opportunity and the space to be able to think about that.
Yeah.
And then to have, as I said, like a partner who was willing to support me doing that, and the resources from my, at the time, my parents were still willing to help fund their child's education, even when he was like 42, which is, that was a tremendous debt of gratitude that I owe to them. But to broaden out the conversation, I often think of this one, I tend to work a lot, and my mind works in metaphors and images and things like that. But the one that was coming to mind there was that, life is, I think for a lot of guys, it's kind of akin to like a naval voyage, right? We're on this boat that we have either feel that we're in control of the boat. Like if we're lucky, we're the captain of the boat and we're getting to choose where it's going. Sometimes we feel like we're crewing someone else's boat, frankly, right? And middle age arrives and we can kind of see land in the distance, right? Now that land might be retirement, that land might be death, right? Whichever way we're conceptualizing this. But we're kind of aware of whatever the finish line is coming, whether it's the finish line of my career or the finish line of my life. And so we're thinking about, well, am I on the right course? Have I navigated? Am I getting to where I want to get to with this? And is there still time to go to some other land? Like, are there other islands around that I might end up on? And where do I want to end up, right? So what kind of aspirations did I hold for myself? And I think this is a fascinating question to ask of ourselves and of people we meet. What were your aspirations when you were young? What were the things that motivated you? Where did you want to see yourself right now? If you could have that conversation with that younger self, what would he have said? What would he have hoped for, right? Because was it this? Was it where you are? Is this what he was hoping for you? Or was it something else? And if it was something else and that other thing still has relevancy to you and still feels like, as I said, in my case, the itch that I never scratched, is there still something you can do about that, right? And obviously understanding that may involve risk, and understanding that may involve placing demands on your system, placing pressure on those people around you if you are to make that change, if you are going to do it. But ultimately, we're all on a journey which has an end. And where do we want to get to before it ends?
And arguably, there's bigger risk of not doing something.
Absolutely.
Because you might just crash that boat into that island, right?
Yeah.
And regret everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
You referenced, what did the younger version of you hope for you and where are you now? Can I just take that question and flip it on its head? For you, Ben Larke, what do you think the 75-year-old version of you would be asking of you now if they could talk to you?
It's probably something around, this is a conversation I was having with someone therapeutically. Do less, notice more. Not to say that I want to necessarily work less. I titrate my work quite well, and I've learned to do that over the years, so that I'm a kind of measured and stable, useful resource to others. I kind of need to look after myself, so I need to be careful about that. But yeah, the allowing work to overtake certain other relationships in my life, having enough left over for those things around me, is something that I can lose sight of. And so I suspect that my 75-year-old self might be looking back going, you remember when you were 52 and one of your sons had just graduated high school and the other one was getting to the end? Like, how much time, maybe it'd be good to spend a bit more time with those guys and checking in with them, and also exploring yourself, right? Because I could be lazy. I think we can all be lazy, right? But the creativity side of life, the play, right? I'm not bad at playing, but I could always do with a bit more. And I think most of us as middle-aged men, it sounds strange to say, right? Because as a society, we've kind of put play in a box of childhood, right? We've kind of said that's okay for the kids, right? And then we get into adults and it's responsibilities and it's seriousness and all of these things, right? And we lose the art of play. We can be playful when we don't know. When we've got mastery on board, when we consider ourselves to be intelligent or masters or, experts in a certain field, we kind of get a bit boring and dull, right? At the same time, because we think we got all the answers, right? So nothing surprising is there. There's something about doing new things, right? Throwing ourselves into, whether it's like, I don't know, going and doing a pottery course, starting ballroom dancing, all of those kind of things where...
Podcast,
right? Where we go into it. Well, in your case, you're a bit of an old hand at this and you're a bit of an expert,
There's an old hand.
There's a fair bit of expertise that I feel, right? But that's one thing that I think I'm trying to tell myself now, and this is obviously a message to me in the present, but I think my older self will be saying, come on, was there enough play there? Was there enough playfulness, right? Or were you still caught up in taking yourself too seriously? Because one of my problems for most of my life is I have taken myself a lot too seriously, I think, right? Yeah, got a lot caught up in the world of wanting to be, I don't know, aspiring, again, talking about parental relationships. My dad was an academic. I think one of the ways that I tried to validate myself in his eyes was to be smart, right? It's also a protection mechanism as well. Doesn't always serve me though, right? Doesn't always serve me. Often ties me up in knots.
There's two sides to every coin. That's one of them. That's exactly right. Yeah. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I appreciate you coming in. I want to kind of maybe draw a red ribbon around one key point that you raised earlier, and we didn't talk about this enough. Richard Rohr, the American writer and priest, says, what we don't transform, we transmit to the next generation. And going back to the very, very first comment about shame, it's often starts because our parents just didn't know what they were doing and they were doing their best. But if we don't address that, we could well just pass that on. And in light of International Men's Day was recently, the notion of fatherhood and sons. You and I both have I have one son, you got two. The risk here is that we don't address stuff, we pass that on to our next generation. So the invitation, I suppose, is just pause. And if you have compulsive behaviors that are in secret, that might be a signal to do something, and at least to consider something. So on that note, last question for you, Ben, is any final words of wisdom you want to share with anyone listening to here today?
I might just pick up on that thread that you've introduced there, because I think it's such a profound truth. Like, what we fail to transform, of course, we will transmit. Of course, will be passed down. And how that relates to shame, I feel that very strongly. I think in some of the work that I've done on myself, and some of the work that I'm lucky enough to help do with other people, some of the most profound shames that we can feel as a parent is when we catch ourselves in a reenactment. We've often made like internal deals with ourselves. I will never be like him. I will never say that to my kids, right? Without really thinking about it, we are thinking, I think, often as men from an early age about transforming, the sins of the father. What are we gonna pass on? How are we gonna change that? One of the most profound ways I think that we can feel shame is when we catch ourselves in those moments going, oh my God, I'm just doing exactly the same thing here.
As she did or he did. Yeah.
As she did or he did. And I'm passing it on. The only reason I raise that is certainly not to chastise any of us when we catch ourselves in that moment, but it's to offer a thought, which is when we're talking about integration, as I've raised briefly today, and this idea of integration and compassion for self, what we need to notice in those moments of reenactment is, and what we want to cultivate again is some form of compassion to ourselves in that moment. We are doing the best we can with the resources that are available to us in that moment as well. We are falling short of a mark that we would like to be at, right? An aspiration, but we're still doing the best that we can. And we can still change going forward, right? But it's important to, if we can, navigate away from the shame that wants to tell me that I am fundamentally bad for having just done what I did, right? It's just to say that act fell short, but there is still the possibility for me to act better tomorrow. Right?
Yes, I've just fallen short in this moment.
Yeah.
Not in general. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Ben Larke, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure, Pod. Thank you.
I really enjoyed that conversation with Ben. My first reflection is the fundamental distinction between shame and guilt. Shame operates at the level of identity. I am defective. Whereas guilt concerns actions already taken but regretted. I did something wrong. They are two dramatically different perspectives. Shame is about self-labeling, becoming deeply meshed with how we see ourselves. And this distinction explains why shame is so much more damaging. Whereas guilt-related actions can be corrected, apologies for, turned around, or fixed. Shame attacks our fundamental sense of worthiness, who we are as humans. It goes deep, and it continues over time. Our nervous systems can then habituate to familiar states, even familiar but painful ones. If we grow up feeling ashamed, that state becomes comfortable in its familiarity. We unconsciously repeat patterns that make choices that return us to known emotional territory, not because we want to, but because it fits neurologically. Which leads to another reflection I've had since talking to Ben, and that is compulsive behaviors serve a function. Addictions and compulsive behaviors, whether substance, shopping, pornography, sex, etc., always serve a purpose. That is to escape from something, or to numb emotional pain, or to release dopamine, or to have a perceived reward in an otherwise unfulfilling life. Understanding this function is crucial to addressing the behavior and not just judging it or eliminating it. And I loved his metaphor that we are like a car or a bus with multiple passengers, describing our emotional parts. It could be our young parts, a coping part, a parental part, a traumatized part. Only one part of us can drive at a time, but we don't always control which part is in the driver's seat. Now, the goal of therapy or any kind of intimate conversation with a friend is not in eliminating the difficult parts, but having the coping part in the passenger seat with one hand on the wheel, stabilizing the journey and reaching back to comfort that traumatized part who's always in the car. The third reflection I've had is this notion of masculinity, conditioning, and potentially putting walls around human sensitivity, particularly our own. That sensitive, connecting parts of men, core to us being humans, are often walled off through masculine conditioning. Boys don't cry, or be stoic. Now, we've discussed this idea many times in previous episodes. But this suppressed sensitivity doesn't disappear. It gets locked away behind a protective barrier that later creates disconnection in relationship or potentially causes internal fragmentation of who we are. Whether we feel validated for who we were, not just for our achievements, actually shapes our core sense of lovability and worthiness. Ben referred to a notion called attachment wounds. They were the unplanned or inadvertent wounds that commenced with early caregiver relationships, such as when our parents were distracted or unavailable, or maybe they were conditioned in their love. And those interactions created lasting patterns in how we connect or how we perceive ourselves. So you then fast forward 4 or 5 decades later, and for many of us men who spent decades in perpetual motion, chasing the next job, the next country, the next project, the next win, the next achievement, midlife often forces a personal reckoning. When life finally slows down or its stability arrives, the unprocessed material from earlier life catches up, manifesting as a potential midlife crisis, a relationship breakdown, or maybe catalyzing major life changes. At that point, we have a few choices, one of which is to address the original reasons of whatever is causing us to feel ashamed and to figure out how to move past that finally. Ben suggested, and I wholeheartedly agree with him, the first and most crucial initial action is telling another human being about what you carry in secret. And that can be a friend, of course. The monster in the closet becomes manageable when exposed to light. Shame grows in isolation. Sharing with someone trustworthy, be it a friend, a therapist, a sponsor in AA, immediately reduces its power and transforms self-perception. This is the first step towards forgiveness of self and forgiveness of others. And finally, regarding the conversation about midlife reinvention, Ben's personal journey that he shared illustrates a very common pattern. what attracted us in our 20s or even earlier often resurfaces as the path we want to or meant to follow decades later. And the opportunity comes knocking on our door at midlife. Midlife often offers the opportunity to consciously revisit and reclaim those early callings, now enriched by life experience and hard-won wisdom. So, they're my reflections. I've got one experiment that I'm going to suggest for anyone listening to this that might be interested. And goes back to the metaphor of many parts driving the bus or driving the car. And it's the parts identification and compassion practice. So over the next couple of weeks, my suggestion is notice whenever you're emotionally activated or reactive. And in those moments, or shortly afterwards, ask yourself, which part of me is driving the bus right now? Which part of me is driving the bus? Simply identify those parts. Name the parts. Is it your hypervigilant protector? Is it your angry defender? Is it your people pleaser? Give them a name. Recognize it. And then a few weeks later, after you've identified that recurring part, practice having a coping part if you reach back with compassion. Literally imagine yourself saying, hey, I see you. I understand why you're here. Thanks for trying to protect me, but we're good. I'm okay. I don't need you to drive the bus today. Now, why this matters is this practice develops an internal sense of compassion. Ben describes this as creating a space between stimulus and response. You'll begin to notice patterns of when the part shows up, what kind of situations, and you start allowing yourself to have a choice, whether to be responsive to the moment, to be driven by automatic reactions, or to pause and react differently. And I can tell you from personal experience, this process works surprisingly well. Ben's wisdom throughout this conversation centers on a profound truth. Transformation begins with understanding and compassion, not judgment. Whether you're addressing shame, compulsive behaviors, and midlife reinvention, the path involves acknowledging all parts of ourselves, breaking isolation through connection, and meeting our own sense of humanity, imperfect as we are, but meeting us with the same generosity we would offer to another dear friend. The invitation isn't to fix yourself or to achieve some idealized version of masculinity. It is to become more conscious of who you are, more compassionate with who we are first, and then with others. As Ben powerfully stated at the end of our interview, what we don't transform, we transmit. The work we do on ourselves is not just for ourselves, it's actually generational. And on that note, don't let the old man in.